would like to welcome you all to the conversation we're going to have about the exposome brain development and vulnerability to mental illness. Today we have Dr. Vivek Benegal from NIMHANS, and we have Vanessa D'Souza from Society for Nutrition Education and Health Action. I'll just brief you a little bit about the talk. Adverse childhood experiences are known to have lifelong effects on one's physical and mental well-being. However, what constitutes adverse and how much is the effect? Through the lens of neuroscience, this talk will look at how closely we can examine these effects as they appear in the brain and what redressal might look like. I would like to hand over to Vanessa.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I know the hall is empty because everyone's gone for lunch. Dr. Vivek, thank you and welcome for coming in today. You almost missed today. He thought it was tomorrow, so thank you for joining in. I have to say, when I was asked to do this, I was a bit nervous because I'm not a medical doctor, and this kind of study that Dr. Vivek is doing, seemed really intimidating to me. But I think the reason I took it up is because at Sneha, the kind of work we do is very closely linked to what Dr. Vivek is trying to do. And I thought it was really relevant for us to actually talk about the same issue, but from a very different lens. He's talking from the lens of science, the lens of the human body and the external environment. And we're talking from the lens of how we're trying to solve issues in vulnerable urban informal settlements. So Dr. Vivek has done, as most of you know, he said many of you are his students today. So he's done a study, a long-term cohort study called the Indian Neurodevelopment Cohort. Please correct me if that's wrong, Dr. Vivek, where he's tried to study from conception to the age of 30 years how the external environment is impacting the physical and mental development of the child and how that possibly can predict long-term mental health vulnerabilities. Dr. Vivek, I think before we get into the whole discussion, my understanding of exposome is that it is a term coined in 2005 by Dr. Christopher Wilde. And you can please clarify this, but my understanding is that exposome actually has three domains, right? There is, first of all, an external there is an internal domain, which is your metabolic system, inflammatory stress, gut microbiomes, etc. The second is the external, which is your the way the kind of nutrition you have, the diet, the way you respond, your stressors, your ability to cope with stress, more restorative issues, as well as pollution. Very important is pollution. And the third is more general, socio-economic, education, which is also very much external. What I would like you to, first of all, unwrap for us is what is the term exposome and how is this actually impacting the growth and development of this unborn child right from the womb right up to 30. But we will today focus on just pregnancy and 0 to 6 years because, we don't want to run through the whole gamut. But I want to just very quickly explain to me what this whole exposome is and how it differs from the genetic makeup that most of us think is actually what determines. I'm going to put your slide up. This is your first slide. You can start talking.
Thanks, Vanessa. Before I start, a slight correction.
Please.
Vivek Benegal does not do the study. My team is here. Will they stand up, please? Yeah. So these are the people who do the study, and along with various other people, like young people like them, across 9 centers in India. So what we are basically trying to do is to understand how the human brain develops from before birth into adulthood and hopefully across into senescence. So from 0 to 100. And the reason why we feel we need to do that is to develop two things. One is to develop maps of the human brain growing up. If you have to go anywhere, you have to have a map. So if you have to find out whether somebody is doing well, not doing well, etc., you need a map. You need a growth curve. Like the pediatricians have growth curves that they use to look at various things, and you, and exactly, and you see whether the child is doing well, not doing well, and then you use measures to bump the child up. So we wanted to do that for brain health, and that is something that we have done. I will talk about it a little bit. The other reason why we wanted to look at how human brains grow is to look at the various factors which affect the trajectories of this growth. Because as we know that when the brain is being created, there are two forces that sculpt the human brain. One is what we call program-dependent development. It's dependent on the instructions which are written in your genome, in the genes, which is inherited. And so that takes care of how your eyes are constructed, how your ears are constructed, how all these systems are constructed. But from the very moment of conception and the development of the brain, there's another set of forces which weigh in on this process, which we call experience-dependent development. So from day one of the creation of the human brain, every day in every way, the environment that the fetus is growing up in, that the child will grow up in, that the adolescent will grow up in, that the adult will grow up in, is modifying the instructions which are there on the genetic code by switching on or switching off certain genes to make changes to the original program, to the original plan. Which is why animal brains are so flexible, and we can live in the tundra, we can live at 0 degrees, we can live hopefully with the changes that are occurring with climate change, that we are flexible. So if you look at that, you have the genome giving instructions to create brain networks, and it's the functioning of brain networks, which is parts of the brain which work together, which talk together, which give rise to our psychological abilities, our abilities to engage with our world. What is the job of the human brain or the animal brain? To engage with the world and to carry on its various functions. And to do that, what the brain needs to do, I'm taking a little bit of time here.
Sure.
If anybody is getting confused, immediately they can put up their hands. The job of the human brain, basically, remember, it's just a blob of flesh encased in a prison of bone. It cannot see into the outside world. So it has to take in sensations that it gets from, all the organs that we have for vision, for hearing, for taste, for, all the data that we get from our heart, from our lungs, from our stomach, and then make sense out of it. And how it makes sense is by comparing it with the information that we already have, a sense of the world that we already have developed in our brains. And every moment, we are trying to predict what is going to happen next. You're going to predict next. You have these predictive things on your phone that predict the kind of sentence that. So that's what the brain is trying to do. And sometimes it creates utter nonsense, as your phones do. And sometimes it gets it right. So the genome creates the brain networks, which are responsible for our psychological abilities. But the exposome, and here I'm coming to the exposome. She's getting very worried as to why I'm not talking about the exposome. The exposome is basically the totality of all the experiences that a human being or an animal faces throughout its life. So whether it is in fetal stage, whether it is in childhood, or whether it is as aging people, the exposome is the sum of all this, the sum of all the external exposures that we get from our environment, as well as the internal exposures. And these, like I said, through various mechanisms, keep changing the genetic program. We call this a process of epigenesis or epigenetic modification of the genome. We won't go into those details, but there are several periods when this becomes very, very important, to come back to your earlier age. The first period when the exposure to the environment is really critical is when the fetus is in the mother's womb. And sometimes maternal inflammatory activation, the inflammation occurs in the mother, and this inflammation is basically stress. So when we talk about stress, we talk about psychological stress. That's one of the reasons. But there can be stress because of exposure to the environment, to the toxins in the environment, whether it's pollution, whether it's heat, whether it's various things, or diet and nutrition of the mother, or whether it is infection. So all of these cause stress, cause inflammation, and then change the program. The crazy thing is that when you have an initial stress, initial inflammation, that also programs the growing brain into anticipating further. If you heard Vidita's talk in the morning, that once you see a tiger, your brain gets used to or anticipates that you will see many more tigers later. And so the next time there is stress, which could be in childhood, when you have childhood adversity, which we are going to talk about, it could be later in adolescence when adolescents get exposed to drugs or stress or various other things, educational issues, etc. Or it could be in ripe old age when you're exposed further to various toxins in the environment, etc. The system mounts an exaggerated response, which is exactly what, say, vaccines do. And because of that exaggerated response, there is an exaggerated sculpting of the brain, which then, of course, its abilities to deal with the universe also change. So it's an iterative process. So the earlier this period in the fetal stage, which is what she's going to talk about, is really very important because the systems are set in then. The early warning systems are set in then. A lot of things happen at that period. I'll stop there because otherwise I'll keep going.
Very interesting, thank you. So Dr. Vivek, you talked of adversities, and at Sneha we work on a couple of adversities. So we work right from pregnancy to 6 years of age, but with particular focus on what we call the first 1,000 days, which is pregnancy to 2 years. It's also called the golden period. And the first aspect, actually, we look at 3 aspects. First is nutrition. And 3 forms of nutrition, as we know, are wasting, stunting, and underweight. And it was interesting, when we were working on our first program, we found there was a certain cohort of children that despite our intervention, we were not able to get out of malnutrition. So we then decided, let's do a qualitative study on those households to understand what was happening. And in every one of those households, we either found domestic violence or some serious social issue. So then that's when we actually integrated an intervention of domestic violence and mental health of the mother into our intervention. But before I go into what we're doing and what we're actually seeing in the community, and I just wanted to say this is the community. It's a small community where we work on nutrition, we work on early childhood development, as well as we work on maternal mental health and domestic violence. And if you look at this data, this is the socioeconomic data, you'd see like most urban informal settlements, about 50% of the people are migratory. Now that again is an additional stress factor. The rest of the factors we see, water, sanitation, is good. Dr. Vivek, I want you to share over here how childhood adversity actually impacts childhood experiences.
Since we talked about early adversity and how it affects, this is some work which was done by my colleague Bharat Holla. He's very much part of our MAD group, where we were able to show that, if you look at the blue line, it is people who have lower genetic risk. So I'm not going to go into details about how we determine genetic risk, but basically we look at the entire genome and we see whether you have the genes which have been implicated in XYZ disorder, etc. These were kids, the red ones are kids who had a higher genetic risk for what we call externalizing disorders. These are like ADHD, addiction, conduct disorder, or stuff like that. And they tended to have a lot of that in their families, and therefore we thought they had higher genetic risk. And they had the genes for that. And the blue ones were lower on genetic risk. And if you look at the x-axis at bottom, is basically a measure of adverse experiences. So as you can see, for everyone, as adverse childhood experiences worsened, that is the number of experiences that the person had, the quantity and the frequency, the cognitive functioning or externalizing psychopathology on the other side, on the y-axis, which is, the same kind of problems: inability to concentrate, difficulty in sustaining motivation, impulsivity, difficulty in controlling your emotions, stuff like that. That tended to increase. But the guys who had higher genetic risk, it increased dramatically. Similarly, this on my left-hand side is adverse childhood experiences mapped against substance use, and we get the same kind of thing. So as adverse childhood experiences increase, your risk for subsequent disorders increase. And that's a general truism. But if you have risk genes, they tend to be, the effect seems to be much more. So we call this so that's what this particular thing shows.
Should I go to the next
Yeah.
one? Yeah. You want to talk about this?
Okay, this is a slide. You don't really need to go into this slide. Let me explain it to you. So what we did was we took MRI scans of brains. So that's a lot of what I do with young people. I catch hold of young people and shove them into scanners, and So I mean, young people try to avoid me these days. So what we did was basically looked at some of the circuits, some of the brain circuits which are responsible for various psychological abilities that we have. And we tried to see whether there was a difference between children who had adversity and children who did not have adversity. And we found that there was a very strong effect on children, these were children who had grown up, on children who had greater adversity in childhood. Their brains carried a lot more differences in a particular circuit called the default mode network. I won't go into details, but the default mode network is basically where the soul lies, the ego lies, the mind chats with each other and catches up on how are you, what's happening in the world, etc., etc. So what we found that the marks of childhood adversity disrupt the typical maturation of the brain, and these marks remain almost forever. So it's a scary thought, but I think Vanessa will tell us how to get rid of some of these marks.
More
okay.
That you wanted to just explain.
So this is something that we're very, very proud of. So one of the reasons that I told you that we try to do is create these normative curves, the normal curves of development. And so this is something that we collaborated with an international consortium, and all of us put in together about 1.5 million MRI scans together to construct the normal curves. This is the map of the human brain growing up. So for example, you have the map of the gray matter, map of the white matter, etc., from 0 to 100. So now we have the map. So we can start becoming geographers of the brain. So I proudly present this to you as something that we've been able to do, and we've been using this then to see whether there are changes at n is equal to 1 at an individual level. Because the problem with brain sciences is most of the time we look at group difference between one group and another. So when we come to the bedside, when we come to an individual, we are not able to translate those findings. Something that the cardiologists can do, the everybody else and their brothers and sisters can do, but we've never been able to do. So I'm hoping that this will open windows for us. Next. Okay, so this my colleague, Professor Isha Sharma, has been constructing maps of cognition, especially of Indian children. So we now have maps of how cognitive abilities grow, again, from age 6 to age 23. And we are now using this because these are then maps that one can use. And we are now using this. So every time my colleagues here do an assessment of cognitive abilities of psychological functioning, each child we find that we can place them on these centiles of development, and like the pediatricians do, at an individual level we can say that, okay, fine, you're here, and we need to bump you up or whatever.
So that's very interesting. So what you're saying is you're able to plot each individual case against a normal curve. Yeah. So I just want to share 3 types of adversities that we've worked on. The first is malnutrition, and just to explain to you, the on the left are the different forms of malnutrition. The top being the composite score. The column with the pink writing says children whose mothers are survivors of violence. So these children are malnourished and the mothers are survivors of violence. And then the last column is children who are malnourished but mothers are not facing violence. Yeah? And we've been mapping this, the numbers are not very large, but we are seeing some significant difference in wasting. Now, wasting is an acute form of malnutrition, which typically happens when a child falls sick or there's some adversity in the child's environment. And if a mother is facing some kind of illness or in the child, and if the mother is facing domestic violence, her own caregiving abilities for that child are definitely diminished. The second one I want to talk about is early childhood development. And before, again, I go into the data, I want you, Dr. Vivek, to explain to us. So we looked at nutrition, but we looked at undernutrition. Yeah? And in these vulnerable slums, we don't see any significant obesity in the 0 to 3-year-old, right? It's, of course, much higher, begins to climb as they go out into school. But I'd like you to explain what kind of impact both undernutrition as well as obesity have on cognitive development as well as predicting mental health disorders.
Just to help us understand what we mean by adversity, let me go to my colleague.
Hi. Did not prepare for this at all. Just remembering everything that I do at work. Adversity could be any experience that you have that the child would probably perceive as a threat, right? It could be something as simple as harsh, punitive parenting techniques. It could be financial stress. It could be physical abuse. It could be emotional neglect, right? It could be sexual abuse. Malnutrition, mother's malnutrition, mother's mental health, father's level of substance use, father's mental health, affected families. Parents are fine, but something's happening at the grandparent level, right? These are some of the examples. These are some of the things that we're also covering in our study. So how all of this affects children and how we're trying to understand how it affects us, there are 2 things. Like Sir said, what you're born with, your genes, right? So you're already predisposed. Suppose someone at home is an alcoholic. Suppose you're born into a family that has a family history of schizophrenia. You already have the genes for that. You go through life where you experience what is called hits, repeated hits to your development, right? So there's a very popular theory, the stress diathesis model. When you grow up, you keep receiving developmental insults, lack of nutrition, bullying in the school environment, right? That shapes how your brain processes the world. So not only now do you have the genetic vulnerability to go through life with some difficulties, your environment is also stressing you out. So how does your brain respond in these situations? For some people, you probably shut down. For some people, you're able to overcome it and go through life, which is what we're trying to look at.
Thanks. Thanks a lot. I can never remember all those things. Yes, so it's a whole lot. The reason why I'm showing you this is a fascinating, not fascinating, I can't find the word for it. It's a scary finding. So basically, when we looked at our kids, and we have this whole span, because we looked at about 9,000 kids all across India. And when we looked at our kids, we find that, of course, undernutrition, as you're talking about, decreases cognitive ability, right? And that's expected. But what we didn't expect was overnutrition. You can see this is like an S. Overnutrition also decreases cognitive ability. And this is scary, but this is something that other people have also found out. So especially post-pandemic, there are 3 or 4 factors which seem to be affecting the mental health of younger people. One is, of course, nutrition and the reliance on ultra-processed food. All your Maggi and your all that stuff. The second one is reliance on this.
Yeah.
Social media and this. This really stunts your brain. Again, we have data for that. I don't have a slide for that. And of course, this contributes to loneliness, which is a big problem, especially in young people. And the third thing that happens, which is a little difficult to quantify, is this loss of purpose in life. Which also has happened to the post-pandemic youngsters. So anyway, just to flag that. So this is the slide that I had. I hope I've explained this thing, which is.
So I just want to share here, this is where we've looked at children who, with milestone development delays. And just to give you a sense that, we have around every 6 months. And totally, we've covered about 4,088 children were screened, of which you can see about 14% have shown milestone delays. Now, about 49% of them actually need to visit a therapist. So, they have to go, they have speech issues, they have hearing issues, etc. And the balance 51% have issues, just slight delays with, difficulties in actually doing things independently, difficulties in playing. And we have found that with very simple home-based counseling of the mothers and simple things like giving a child, a spoon and a plate to play, or maybe some vegetables to play with, communicating to the child, having the mother and child communicate to each other. Very often in these communities, older siblings are looking after the kids, and the kids, are not well attended to. So communication is important. Just making sure, looking into the eyes of the child, making the child feel special. And just simple interventions like this. We've seen within 6 to 12 months, children with these kind of delays actually come out of the delays. Children who get therapeutic treatment, we've seen about 83% are normal. Now, I think what is important over here is to say that while we cannot control the entire environment, but what we can control with simple home-based solutions as well as through therapists, we want to try and address so that we put kids back onto the normal curve as soon as possible. Now, this is an interesting slide where if you look at the top box, that's children who are malnourished. And we've looked at 2 rounds of screening them for developmental delays, and there are 3 forms of malnutrition there. And the lower box are children who are not malnourished. So let's look at the first one where we say round 4, developmentally delayed children, you have 14% children who are malnourished and developmentally delayed versus 8% who are normal children and developmentally delayed. Now, if you look similarly on the next box in blue, and you look at again round 4, for both malnourished as well as normal kids, again you'll see a difference. And of course, again last, if you look at underweight and you look at developmentally delayed and you look at normal children who are not malnourished, you are seeing a significant difference. And I think here, Dr. Vivek, we are able to show, to prove that there is an association between malnutrition and developmental delays. Yeah.
But just to carry on what you were saying.
Yeah.
But please remember, what this shows you is that the brain is immensely forgiving.
Yeah.
And that you can intervene. So when we give you the bad news, we need to give you the good news as well.
Correct.
That it's this. Your data shows that we can
intervene.
And we need to do something.
That's right. So I'm going to the next adversity, which is association between milestone development delays as well as mothers' mental health and domestic violence. Yeah. And here, interestingly, and we have taken data in. So this the first the higher box is women experiencing violence, and then developmentally delayed versus women not experiencing violence and developmentally delayed. And again, you can see, it's 21 there versus not experiencing violence 11. If you look at women experiencing anxiety who have children developmentally delayed, it's 25% versus, again, no anxiety is 14%. But I have to say, these numbers are not large enough. So if we look at the April 23, we're not seeing any significant difference. In fact, we're seeing a larger number of children who are developmentally delayed whose mothers are not facing violence. The point I think we're trying to make, and again here, it's very similar, the periods are just different. I think the point here, and again, if you see here, developmentally delayed mothers experiencing violence is 0. Now, I think one of the reasons why we're still not able to see this kind of a longer term association is, one, we have started doing this quite recently. So the N number is very small. Yeah. The second is, as we continue doing this over a period of time, when we have a larger sample size, it is possible, we don't know, it is possible that some patterns may emerge between mothers facing violence as well as and anxiety as well as development milestones.
I was just a little curious. How old are your oldest kids here?
0 to 3. Only 0 to 3.
You're not going to see much there.
We'll see it later. That's interesting.
6 to 10.
Okay. So we're not tracking that. Maybe we should start tracking older. We only track 0 to 3. Okay, that's good. Thank you for sharing that. I think definitely worth us looking at. I now want to move to another topic, and this is about the environment. And again, I know most of you here are, familiar with urban informal settlements, but I want to just run through some just key points, and I'm just quickly going to flip through photographs, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Vivek how all this is impacting growth and development, both pregnant women as well as 0 to 3, so really from conception. So the first big one we see is heat, right? These houses have tin roofs. In fact, just yesterday, my team was telling me that mothers are keeping their babies in buckets the whole day, buckets of water, simply because that's the only way for them to keep the child cool. The second is space constraints and lack of ventilation. These are, again, adversities that we are seeing, and this is becoming a huge stressor for even for exercise. Neither pregnant women nor children are getting exercise, and I think that's again leading to a lot of the obesity. This is another challenge, flooding, especially in cities where we see flooding happening often. You see houses are below the level of the lanes. So flooding again causes a lot of disruption and adversity. Very poor sanitation in the lanes. You see open gutters. We are seeing high levels. 27% of our children are ill at any point in time. Yeah? Poor garbage disposal, again, a huge sanitation issue. This is another thing. In the informal settlements, in almost every second home, we find some kind of household occupation, and clearly very hazardous occupations, as you can see. This is metal burning. We see sometimes they're cooking, they're catering for large events, and you see fire, you see smoke, you see, and all in this very unventilated place. And this is all leading, you see this poor child, skin infections is a huge problem. And this is another strong, it's a huge adversity for a kid who's constantly falling sick. Not only is it impacting malnutrition, but it's also creating a lot of stress for the mother. And easy access to hygienic food. I have to share one interesting thing with you. In the last study we did on our kids in anemia and adolescents, we always see higher anemia in girls than in boys. This time, we have seen higher in boys than in girls. And one of the challenges that we've seen is boys today have access to mobile phones, they have money, and they're all ordering on your Swiggy and so on and so forth. Whereas girls, because they don't have as much mobility as the boys, tend to eat a lot more home-cooked food. So, you just talked about mobile phones, and now mobile phones has implications in very different ways, even on skewing on gender-related issues. I want to ask you, Dr. Vivek, can you share with us, it's not just one, it's an interplay of multiple issues, right? So if we have to, if we have to first of all understand what is the implication of heat, of chemicals, of, sanitation, how do we begin to understand what is the implication on the development both, as well as the mental health of the mother and the child?
A lot of these are modifiable risk factors, and what they do, let me lead you through some of our findings here. I think I'm missing one slide here, but basically...
Is it the next one? You want me
No,
to check?
it's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's my fault. I haven't put that diagram in. What we have found in this particular assay, this thing that we did, was children who are exposed. See, all our children are geotagged. So we know what is happening to them for the last 20 years, that is, ever since birth. And so we are able to see how much exposure to, in this case, to air pollution. You know, you've heard of PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5. So with our kids, we were able to map our kids in the north, in the northeast, in the south. We were able to map how much of exposure to air pollution they had in the last 20 years of their life, which was for most of them their entire lives. And we were also able to map the highs and lows. But basically, net, the greater the exposure to air pollution, the more delayed was their cognitive abilities, right? Which is bad enough. But when you looked at other factors, whether they came from higher socioeconomic factor or not, whether their nutrition was good or not, you found that these added up. So socioeconomic status, lower socioeconomic status added 9%. That's a huge amount to the risk. Lower BMI, that is your nutrition, added 4%. And the PM 2.5 added 3%. You know, I mean, the percentage numbers are not important, but it's a matrix of risk. You know, like a net, you pull one, you pull everything. And that is the scary bit. And so things like socioeconomic status, other things. I'll show you another one. So basically, we
She's told me we're 5 minutes to wrap up, so we have to hurry.
So we'll just run through these.
Yeah.
So the way it's happening is through delay in brain development. Here, which shows delay in white matter. You know, you have gray matter and white matter. There's a delay in white matter maturity, which we are able to show. So anyway, so that's the last slide was, before that,
Yeah, sorry.
was exposure to arsenic in groundwater. Now, all of us who are in the shadow of the Himalayas, which has arsenic-laden rocks, whether you are, drinking the water of Amudarya, or whether it's the Brahmaputra or the Ganga or the Red River or the whatever, we are taking in a lot of arsenic. And it's being concentrated in the rice that we have, by a factor of 4, which is why my South Indian children have greater arsenic than my North Indian children. But anyway, what this seems to do, exposure to arsenic, seems to, affect brain structure, affect brain white matter, affect, brain networks, and finally, obviously, affect psychological abilities. So I do not have this picture up, but then because you brought up all those things, this consortium that I was talking about, 1.5 million brain scans. So we've gone all around the world and seen what are the differences in women's brains, especially women from societies which have poorer gender balance. And we find that women from poorer gender balanced countries have, I wouldn't say poorer, but differences in brain development, especially in areas which are related to memory, which are related to certain other functions. So even things like gender disparity in your society are changing and sculpting your brains differentially.
Interesting.
And so that's something to think about.
So, Dr. Vivek, I'm going to go to my last question now. There are lots of problems and we can't solve the problem of the world. But let's end with saying, what can we do? As a government, the government is aware, that nutrition is a big issue, mental health is a big issue. And they have, for example, an ICDS that has also started now on working on early childhood development in addition to nutrition. You have talked about an integrated intervention from pregnancy right through young age. Can you share with us what this integrated intervention is and how that will help to an extent to circumvent some of at least reduce the implications?
So to begin with, it's a lot of what you do.
True.
No, let's go.
You want to go? You want to go to this, right?
Yeah, no, next
Go
one.
next one.
Yeah. So one of the things that we find implicated.
Your mind.
Oh, sorry. One of the things that seems to be common across all these risk factors, like I began with, is about this whole stress, which causes inflammation, which causes all these changes in the brain programming. So we feel that you need to go after stress and stress reduction. I mean, somebody will come up with genetic solutions, somebody will come up with medical solutions, but that's not going to happen for the next 20, 25 years, if at all. But we can think in terms of public health interventions, universal interventions, which reduces stress and inflammation. And so some of the things that we've started doing, and this is a project that we have started, is trying to look at early intervention, multi-component intervention, starting with mothers in their second trimester. I would have liked to have started earlier, but there's no way of catching mothers while the child is still a twinkle of hope in her eye. So what we're doing is adding supplementation like you're doing. The only thing we're adding choline and other things, which I would wish that you guys would also think of, because there's a lot of data for that. Right. We are adding prenatal and antenatal interventions for the mother, basic things like pregnancy yoga and things like that to reduce stress and inflammation. Because then again, there is a lot of data there. We are putting in parenting interventions because we feel that a whole lot of stress happens there. Yeah. Parenting and
disciplinary action also. Yeah.
So, and the next, I think there's another slide. Yeah. So these are some of the modules that we are using, and we wish to see that if you are able to avert the initial blow, the first hit, as she said, which happens during the maternal fetal stage. Are we able to then reduce the risk somewhat, able to delay the risk somewhat? So that's what we wish to do. And while we wish to do it in a very detailed biological way, right. I would wish to encourage you and invite you to
do it in a community,
in a larger way, so that we can see it in the...
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Vivek. I don't know if there's any time for questions or we need to close now. Okay, we'll open it up. Yeah, we've got someone already putting a hand up for a question. I have to say it is not easy because unfortunately a lot of this is aspirational and the people to blame are all of us. Whether it's junk food, whether it's technology, it's become aspirational. In fact, today, even in low-income homes, the boys, fortunately we haven't yet reached the girls, but the boys are demanding phones. And a mother thinks that if she doesn't give her child 10 rupees to buy junk food, she actually gets criticized by her peers. So one of the things that we were just discussing 2 days ago with another university that we're talking to, saying how do we actually create an environment in the community where people associate healthy eating as a positive behavior rather than packaged food. So it's a complete shift that we have to do. And I think mass media, corporates, everybody needs to cooperate.
Thank you.
So I don't think there is an alternative. Until and unless we can create alternatives, we can actually tackle this problem. Remember that during the pandemic, phones were our savior in many ways than one. Not only did it get you your Swiggy Dome food, it also was the educational lifeline for a lot of the kids. In fact, a few months back, I went to the Sundarbans, where, that's tiger territory. And most of the men have fled to Bangalore and Hyderabad to do shuttering work because you can't grow crops any longer. Most of the old men are sitting and drinking away their time because they have, again, nothing to do. The women are trying to manage their families. The older boys are hooked on to, stimulants which come across the border from Bangladesh. And the young kids are using the phones which they got during the pandemic for their education. That's not happening any longer, and teachers don't come to tiger territory, and they're playing these games all the time. The mothers are crying that they don't come in for food, they don't go to the toilet, they don't have a bath. This is all that they do. So we really need to find solutions, and as you will see that across the world, societies are waking up to this and saying, you need to have a healthy use of technology. You can't get rid of it, obviously, but you don't need the entire tiger in your room.
There's one more. I think we don't have time, but what we can do is after that we can maybe meet outside. So I want to thank you, Dr. Vivek, especially for creating the map with all the million inputs that you had, because unless we know what a normative normal brain is, for us to know if there's any deviation becomes absolutely impossible. So I want to thank you and your whole team that has worked really hard to put this together. It's been an absolutely amazing study, and while there is a lot more for us to learn, I think you've taken the first steps, and I think there's lots of opportunity for us to exchange knowledge, not just Sneha, but the larger community work. Thank you so much to all
and
of
thank you
you.
for bringing the hope into the room.
Thank you, Dr. Vivek and Mannotsava, for this wonderful session.